The dust of the Wyoming Territory tasted like shame. Elara felt it coat her tongue, a gritty film that was the flavor of her undoing. It swirled around the raw timber of the auction block, a makeshift stage for her humiliation in the center of Redemption Creek. Her bare feet, bruised and swollen, rested on wood that had held livestock, criminals, and now her, a widow deemed worthless, a vessel to be sold. The sun beat down with a merciless personal cruelty, bleaching the life from the prairie grass and searing the skin on her neck. Her calico dress, once a hopeful blue, was torn and stained, clinging to the slight, defiant swell of her belly. Inside her, the life her husband Thomas had given her fluttered, a tiny, frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone and sorrow. It was for that life alone that she stood upright, her spine a rod of iron forged in the fires of betrayal. Her in-laws, the Abernethys, stood near the front of the gathering crowd. Martha Abernathy, her mother-in-law, a woman whose hands had once straightened Elara's wedding veil, now held a face of stone, her eyes glittering with a righteous fury that had condemned Elara without trial. They said she was a curse. Thomas had died in a foolhardy accident, a fall from a half-built barn roof, and in their grief, they had needed a serpent to blame. They found one in her, the quiet town girl he had chosen over their objections. They took the farm, the home she had, scrubbed and sanctified with love, and cast her out with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her womb. A bastard born of bad luck, they had called it. They had petitioned the town council, run by men who measured justice in land and coin, and the verdict was swift. She was a burden, a pauper, by the territorial laws that governed the desperate and the destitute. She was to be auctioned off as an indentured servant. Her worth was whatever a man would pay for a strong back and, when her time came, a wet nurse. The auctioneer, a portly man named Blevins with sweat stains blooming under his arms, cleared his throat. "We have here Elara Abernathy," he boomed, his voice scraping against the thick, expectant silence. "A healthy woman, despite her condition, strong, willing, trained in all manner of domestic work." He gestured to her as if she were a mare, and a wave of nausea rolled through Elara. She could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her, 100 tiny pinpricks of judgment, pity, and lust. She saw farmers calculating her worth in bushels of wheat, lonely trappers imagining her warmth in a cold bed, and wives whispering behind their hands, their faces a mixture of relief that it was not them and fear that it could be. Her gaze drifted past them to the wide, endless plains that stretched out to the jagged teeth of the mountains. It was a land of brutal beauty, a place that promised freedom, but so often delivered a cage. She had come here with Thomas full of dreams, her heart a vessel of hope. Now it was a hollowed-out gourd, rattling with the dried seeds of what might have been. A prayer, silent and desperate, formed on her lips, a plea to a God who felt as distant and unforgiving as the empty blue sky. "Let the earth swallow me whole, or let my child live, even if I do not." "Who'll start the bidding?" Blevins bellowed. $10 for a year's service. A bargain for a woman who can cook, clean, and mend. A thick, greasy voice cut through the murmurs. "I'll give you 5. It was Silas Blackwood, a landowner whose cruelty was as vast as his holdings. His eyes, small and dark like a boar's, roamed over her body, lingering on her belly with a sickening grin. He was a man who collected things, land, cattle, people. A ripple of distaste went through the crowd, but no one dared challenge him. $5? Blevins scoffed, though a nervous sweat beaded on his brow. "Mr. Blackwood, the woman, is with child. She provide a worker and a nurse in one." "The brat's a liability," Blackwood sneered. 5. Take it or leave it. No one else is bidding on Abernathy's bad luck. He was right. A dead silence fell. This was it. This was the end of her world, to be handed over to a man like Blackwood, to have her child born into his cruel possession. Ilara closed her eyes, the single tear she had refused to shed finally breaking free, tracing a path of searing heat through the dust on her cheek. The flutter in her womb stilled, as if the baby could sense the finality of their doom. The auctioneer raised his gavel, a small wooden hammer that held the weight of her entire future. Time stretched, thinned, became a taut wire of pure agony. She could hear the creak of a wagon wheel, the distant cry of a hawk, the pounding of her own blood in her ears. Just as the gavel began its descent, a voice sliced through the tension. It was not loud, but it had the sharp, clear authority of a stone striking steel. $20. Every head in the square turned. The voice came from the back of the crowd, from a man who stood in the long, stark shadow of the blacksmith's shop. He was tall and lean, dressed in clothes that were clean but worn to the texture of the earth itself. His face was all angles and planes, weathered by sun and wind and something deeper, a sorrow that had carved itself into the lines around his eyes. It was Jedediah Stone, the recluse from the broken-down ranch at the edge of the territory, a man who spoke so rarely that townsfolk joked he had traded his voice to the devil for the silence he craved. He hadn't been seen in Redemption Creek in months. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed not on the auctioneer, but on her. They were eyes that did not assess her worth, but simply saw her. Blevins stared, mouth agape. "Jedediah Stone? Your bidding?" Jedediah gave a single sharp nod. He stepped forward, out of the shadows, and the crowd parted for him as if he were a ghost. He looked like a man made of the wilderness itself, his stillness a stark contrast to the town's nervous energy. He was a widower, they whispered. A man haunted by the loss of his wife and child years ago to the fever that had swept through the valley. A man with a wounded soul who had walled himself off from the world in a fortress of grief. Silas Blackwood's face purpled with rage. "What's this the hermit has coined now?" He spat. "I'll bid 30. Jedediah's gaze did not waver from Ilara. 50, he said, his voice quiet but unyielding. He reached into his worn leather pouch and pulled out a handful of coins, placing them on the edge of the platform with a soft final clink. Then he placed a folded yellowed piece of paper beside them. "And the deed to my land." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The deed to his ranch. It was all he had in the world. A failing ranch, perhaps, but it was his. He was bidding his entire existence. It was an act of such reckless, desperate madness that it transcended bidding and became something else entirely. A sacrifice. Blackwood was stunned into silence, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He could not, would not, outbid a man's whole life. Blevins, his eyes wide, looked from the deed to Jedediah, then to Ilara. The rules were the rules. The highest bid must be accepted. He swallowed hard, his bravado gone, replaced by a kind of awe. "Sold," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Sold to Jedediah Stone for $50. And his land." The gavel tapped the block, not with a crack of finality, but with a soft, reverent thud. The sound of a world ending and another beginning. Jedediah stepped forward, his boots silent in the dust. He did not look at the auctioneer or the stunned crowd. He walked to the steps of the platform and held out a hand. It was a large hand, calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who worked the earth until it bled. It did not tremble. It simply waited. Ilara stared at that outstretched hand. It was not the hand of a master claiming his property. It was an offering, a lifeline thrown into the abyss of her despair. She did not know if she was being rescued or merely traded from one prison to another, but in that moment she saw in his stormy eyes a reflection of her own brokenness, a loneliness so profound it felt like coming home. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she lifted her head, straightened her back, and placed her small, trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a warmth that was startling, solid, and real. He did not pull her or drag her. He simply helped her down from the block, and together they turned their backs on the gaping faces of Redemption Creek and walked away. Two broken souls bound by a madman's bid, their shared silence a more powerful testament than any vow ever spoken. The dust swirled around their feet, no longer tasting of shame, but of a terrifying, fragile, and unknown future. The journey to his ranch was a study in silence. Jedediah led a tired-looking mule with their meager new supplies, a sack of flour, beans, and salt he'd purchased with the last of the coins that hadn't gone to buy her freedom. Alara walked beside him, the hard-packed earth unforgiving beneath her bare feet. The silence wasn't empty. It was thick and heavy, filled with the unspoken questions that hung between them like a physical barrier. He had bought her. He owned her service, her labor for a year. The thought was a cold stone in the pit of her stomach. Yet, the way he had looked at her, the way he walked beside her now, not behind or in front, suggested something other than ownership. He seemed as trapped by his own impulsive act as she was. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, and the vastness of the landscape began to feel less like a promise of freedom and more like an endless expanse of isolation. The ranch, when they finally reached it, was less a home and more a monument to decay. The cabin was a small, stooped structure of graying logs, chinked with crumbling mud. The roof sagged in the middle, and a single window stared out like a blind, vacant eye. The barn beside it listed to one side, its doors hanging from broken hinges, a few chickens scattered at their approach, their clucking a lonely, pathetic sound in the overwhelming quiet. This was what he had bid for her. A ruin, a testament to a life that had failed. Alara felt a fresh wave of despair wash over her. She had been traded from public humiliation to private desolation. Jedediah stopped before the cabin door, his face unreadable. "It's not much," he said, the first words he had spoken since they'd left town. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. "It's a roof," she replied, her own voice a hoarse whisper. It was an attempt at strength, but it sounded fragile even to her own ears. He pushed the door open, and it groaned in protest. The inside was one room, dark and musty. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and black with soot. A rough-hewn table with one chair, a cot with a threadbare blanket, and a few dusty shelves holding chipped crockery were the only furnishings. The air was thick with the scent of old grief, of a life that had been extinguished and never rekindled. This was the room where his wife and child had died. Alara could feel it, a palpable chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't just a home, it was a tomb. The first days were a silent, awkward dance of survival. They were two strangers tethered by a bizarre contract, each trapped in their own private hell. Jedediah was a phantom in his own home. He rose before dawn, disappearing into the wilderness with his rifle, and returned after dusk with a rabbit or a brace of birds, which he would leave on the table without a word before retreating to sleep. In the leaning barn, he had given her the cot, the only bed. Alara, her body aching with the pregnancy, spent her days trying to impose order on the chaos. She scrubbed the filthy floorboards with a rag and water from the nearby creek until her knuckles were raw. She swept away years of dust and cobwebs, chasing out the ghosts that seemed to linger in every corner. She found a small, neglected garden patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds, and began to clear it with her bare hands, her fingers sinking into the cool, damp earth. It was backbreaking work, but it was a fight against the decay, a small act of defiance that kept her from succumbing completely to despair. They rarely spoke. Words seemed too flimsy to bridge the chasm of pain that separated them. Their communication was in actions. He would leave firewood stacked by the door. She would have a meager stew simmering over the fire when he returned. She found his mending basket. A needle rusted into a spool of black thread, and began repairing his torn shirts. Her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to the ragged fabric. One evening, she found a pail of fresh, warm milk on the doorstep. She looked out to see Jedediah leading a shaggy-haired goat, its bell making a soft, melodic sound that felt like the first note of music in a world of silence. He had seen her weakness, her struggle to keep down the dry beans and salted meat, and had gone to find her something she could stomach. He didn't say a word, just tethered the goat to a post and walked away. Ilara drank the milk, its richness a balm to her empty stomach and her frayed soul, and cried for the first time since the auction, not from sorrow, but from a sliver of gratitude so sharp it hurt. The nights were the hardest. She lay on the narrow cot, the baby a restless knot inside her, and listened to the sounds of the wilderness, the cry of a coyote, the sigh of the wind through the pines. She could feel Jedediah's presence in the barn, a silent, brooding weight, just a stone's throw away. She wondered about the woman he had lost, the child he had buried. She saw their ghosts in the worn patches on the floor, in the single chipped cup on the shelf. She was sleeping in a dead woman's bed, trying to build a life in the ruins of another's. Some nights, she would be woken by a sound from the barn, a choked cry of anguish that was quickly stifled. It was the sound of his grief, raw and untamed. A beast he wrestled with in the dark. In those moments, her own sorrow felt less lonely. They were two halves of a whole, broken in different ways, but by the same cruel world. One afternoon, as she was pulling weeds from the garden, a wave of dizziness washed over her. The world tilted, the sun-drenched earth rushing up to meet her. She crumpled to the ground, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Jedediah, who she thought had been out hunting, was suddenly there, kneeling beside her. He had been mending the fence line, his hammer and tools lying discarded nearby. His face, usually a mask of stoicism, was etched with alarm. "Ilara," he said, her name sounding strange and powerful on his lips. I'm all right," she stammered, trying to push herself up. "You're not," he stated, his voice firm. He scooped her into his arms with a startling ease. She was light, too light. He carried her into the cabin and laid her gently on the cot. His hands were clumsy as he propped her head up with the thin pillow. He stood over her, a giant shadow of a man, his expression a turmoil of frustration and concern. "You do too much." "There is much to do," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed. "Not all at once," he said, his voice softer now. He left and returned with a cup of water, holding it to her lips. As she drank, their eyes met over the rim of the cup. In that moment, the wall of silence between them cracked. She saw not the haunted recluse, but a man terrified of losing someone again. He saw not the indentured woman he had bought, but a fragile life he was responsible for, a life that held another, even more fragile, life within it. "Why?" she asked, the question that had been burning in her since the auction. "Why did you do it?" He looked away, his gaze falling on the cold hearth. He was silent for a long time, and she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with unshed tears. "I know what it is to have nothing left," he said. I couldn't watch them take the last thing you had." He was talking about her child. He wasn't talking about her dignity or her freedom, but the baby. He had saved her child. He turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving her with the weight of his confession. He hadn't bought a servant. He had rescued a mother. That night, when he returned from the barn to sleep on the cold earth floor by the hearth, she didn't question. A silent truce had been declared. They were no longer just two broken people sharing a roof. They were partners in a desperate struggle for survival, their clumsy attempts at tenderness the first green shoots pushing through the hard, barren ground of their lives. Weeks turned into a month, then two. The sharp edges of their shared existence. began to soften. The silence between them became less a chasm and more a comfortable space, punctuated by the small necessities of life. "The beans are low," she would say, and he would nod, making a mental note for his next trip to town. "The roof leaks by the hearth when it rains," he would state, and the next day he would be up there, patching it with shingles hewn from a fallen pine. They were a team, their movements synchronized by unspoken understanding. He taught her how to set snares, how to read the clouds for signs of a storm. She taught him, through her quiet, persistent care, how to live in his house again. She planted the seeds he'd bought, and a small, determined patch of green began to rise from the earth. The smell of baking bread, made from their dwindling flour supply, began to replace the scent of grief in the cabin. It was the smell of a home being slowly, painstakingly reborn. The trip to Redemption Creek was a necessity they could no longer avoid. The flour was gone, the salt was low, and Alara's time was drawing nearer. She needed fabric for swaddling clothes, a few small things to welcome a new life. Jedediah was reluctant. The town was a viper's nest of judgment, and he had no desire to expose Alara to its venom again. But her quiet insistence won out. "We cannot hide forever," she had said. "The child will be born, and the world will know of it. It is better to face them now." They rode in on the rickety wagon he had repaired, the goat tied to the back, its bell a lonely chime against the creak of the wheels. As they neared the town's main street, Alara felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Heads turned as they passed. Whispers followed them like a swarm of angry bees. She sat straighter on the wagon seat, her hands resting protectively over her swollen belly, a silent declaration. She was not the shamed creature from the auction block. She was a woman on the verge of motherhood, seated beside the man who had given her a chance. Jedediah pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the mercantile. His face was a stoic mask, but Alara could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the reins. He helped her down, his touch firm and steadying. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, the whispers grew louder, more pointed. "Look, it's the hermit and his purchased whore." The voice belonged to one of Silas Blackwood's ranch hands. "Got her belly full now, I see. Wonder if it's his or Abernathy's ghost," another sneered, followed by a burst of cruel laughter. Jedediah's body went rigid. A muscle jumped in his cheek, and for a moment, Alara feared he would lash out, that the quiet man would explode into a violence she had never seen. But he simply turned his stormy eyes on the men, a look so cold and full of quiet fury that their laughter died in their throats. He said nothing. He didn't have to. His silence was more intimidating than any threat. He placed a hand on the small of Alara's back, a gesture of both protection and possession, and guided her into the store. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of cinnamon, leather, and disapproval. The storekeeper's wife, Mrs. Gable, pursed her lips and watched them with hawk-like intensity. Other women in the store gathered their skirts and moved away, creating a small, empty circle around Alara. The isolation was as tangible as a physical wall. Alara kept her gaze fixed on the shelves, her heart pounding a painful rhythm against her ribs. She would not give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not let them see her break. As she was examining a bolt of soft flannel fabric, a shadow fell over her. She looked up to see Martha Abernathy, her former mother-in-law, standing before her. The woman's face was a twisted mask of hatred. "So you show your face here," Martha hissed, her voice low and venomous, "parading your shame for all to see. You carry a bastard, and you've shackled yourself to a godless recluse. My son must be spinning in his grave." "Your son gave me this child," Alara said, her voice shaking but clear. "He loved me." "Love?" Martha spat the word like poison. "You cursed him. You brought ruin to our family, and now you bring it to that broken man. Everything you touch turns to dust." Tears pricked at Alara's eyes, hot and sharp. The cruelty was a physical blow, stealing her breath. She felt Jedediah's presence beside her before she saw him. He moved to stand slightly in front of her, a shield between her and the venomous woman. "That's enough, Martha," he said, his voice a low growl. Martha Abernathy flinched, surprised by his intervention. She looked from Jedediah's cold, hard face to Alara's pale one. "You defend this creature? She is my wife," Jedediah said. The words fell into the sudden shocked silence of the store. He hadn't consulted Alara. He hadn't proposed. He had simply declared it as fact, a truth forged in the crucible of their shared struggle. It was a lie, of course, a shield thrown up in the heat of battle, but it resonated with a power that stunned everyone, including Alara. He was claiming her, not as property, but as family, in front of the very people who had cast her out. Martha Abernathy stared, speechless for a moment, then let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Wife, you fool! You've bought yourself a cursed womb and a bad name. You'll regret this day." She turned on her heel and swept out of the store, her righteousness a black cloud trailing behind her. The store was silent. Everyone had heard. Alara looked at Jedediah, her heart a wild thing in her chest. His gaze met hers, and in it, she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Not just protection, but a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He had drawn a line in the sand. On one side stood the town, with its judgment and its hate. On the other stood the two of them, a mismatched pair bound by a lie that felt more true than anything she had ever known. Just as the tension reached its breaking point, another woman stepped forward. It was Martha, the blacksmith's wife, a large woman with kind eyes and hands permanently stained with soot. She had known loss herself, having buried 2 young children. She looked past the gossiping faces and straight at Alara. She picked up the bolt of flannel Alara had been touching. "This is good, strong fabric," she said, her voice warm and steady, cutting through the hostility. "It'll make fine swaddling clothes. You'll need plenty. They go through them faster than you'd think." She smiled, a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She then turned to her husband, a mountain of a man who had been watching from the doorway. "John, help Mr. Stone load his supplies. The winter is coming on fast, and this woman needs to be home, resting." It was a small act, a simple kindness, but in the face of such public scorn, it was an act of rebellion. The blacksmith nodded, his face stern, and moved to help Jedediah. The spell of judgment was broken. A few other women, emboldened by the blacksmith's wife, offered shy smiles. The storekeeper, Mr. Gable, suddenly found his voice and hurried to tally up their purchases, his tone now respectful. The ride home was as silent as the first journey from the town, but the quality of the silence had changed. It was no longer a void of uncertainty, but a space filled with the weight of Jedediah's declaration, "She is my wife." The words echoed in Alara's mind. A lie spoken to protect her had become the foundation of something new. When they reached the cabin, he helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering for a moment at her waist. "Thank you," she whispered, looking up at his weathered face. He simply nodded, his stormy eyes holding hers. "No one should stand alone," he said. That evening, they sat at the small table together for the first time, sharing a meal of bread and cheese. The single chair had been joined by a stool he had fashioned from a stump. It was a small change, but a significant one. He was no longer sleeping on the floor. He had moved his bedroll to the corner of the room, accepting his place inside the home they were now undeniably sharing. As darkness fell, casting long shadows across the room, Alara took out the flannel and a needle and thread. Jedediah watched her, his hands resting on the table, the firelight playing over the strong lines of his face. He was no longer just a savior or a keeper. He was the man who had called her his wife, the man who had stood against the world for her. And she, in turn, was no longer just the woman he had bought. She was the woman who was turning his tomb back into a home, the woman who carried the future in her womb. The whispers of the town faded, replaced by the crackle of the fire and the soft snip of her scissors cutting the first piece of cloth for their child. They were building a life, not from grand pronouncements, but from small acts of defiance and dignity, turning the town's judgment into the mortar that was, against all odds, binding them together. The first snows came early that year, dusting the peaks of the mountains with a coat of white that crept closer down the slopes each day. The air grew sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and impending winter. The rhythms of their life on the ranch became more urgent. Jedediah worked from dawn until dusk, reinforcing the barn, chopping a mountain of firewood, and hunting, storing smoked meat for the long months ahead. Alara, her body growing heavier, slower, spent her days indoors, canning the last of the vegetables from her small garden, mending their clothes, and stitching the layette for the baby. The cabin, once a hollow shell of grief, was now filled with the steady, quiet hum of preparation. It was warm, clean, and smelled of baking bread and wood smoke. It had become a sanctuary. The lie Jedediah had told in the mercantile had settled between them, an unspoken truth. They were not husband and wife in the eyes of the law or the church, but in the small shared moments of their lives, they had become something more profound. He would watch her as she sat by the fire, her hands moving deftly with a needle, the soft curve of her belly illuminated by the flames, and a look of deep, aching tenderness would soften the harsh lines of his face. She would find a wildflower he had picked tucked into the woodpile, a small, vibrant splash of color against the graying wood, and know it was a message meant only for her. They had not spoken of love. The word was too grand, too fragile for the raw, hard world they inhabited. What they had was something sturdier, built of shared labor, mutual respect, and a fierce protective loyalty. It was a bond forged in silence and survival. The last week of October, the sky turned a bruised, leaden gray. The wind began to howl, a low, mournful sound that rattled the single window pane and tore at the newly patched roof. A blizzard, more violent and sudden than any Jedediah had seen in a decade, descended upon them. Snow fell not in gentle flakes, but in a thick, blinding curtain, erasing the world outside their door. Within hours, the cabin was an isolated island in a sea of white. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the cold was a living thing, seeping through the logs despite the roaring fire Jedediah kept in the hearth. They were trapped, cut off from the world. It was on the second night of the storm that Alara's labor began. It started with a dull ache in her lower back, a familiar discomfort, that soon sharpened into something more insistent, more powerful. She caught her breath, her hand flying to her belly as a contraction seized her, a wave of tightening, breathtaking pain. She looked at Jedediah across the small room, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "It's time," she whispered. A stillness fell over him. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a stark, pale mask. Elora saw in his eyes the ghost of a memory, the shadow of a terror he had lived through once before. This room, this cabin. A woman in labor. He had lost his first wife, Sarah, and their newborn son to a fever that had taken them in this very space. The blizzard raging outside was nothing compared to the storm of memory and fear that now raged within him. He looked frozen, trapped in a past he could not escape. "Jedediah," Alara said, her voice sharp with pain, cutting through his paralysis. "I need you." Her words were a lifeline. He blinked, the ghosts receding, replaced by the urgent reality of the present. Her, the baby, now. He moved, his actions jerky at first, then more certain. He stoked the fire until it blazed, heating a large kettle of water. He tore strips from a clean linen sheet she had painstakingly sewn. His face was grim, set in lines of intense concentration, but his hands, when he took hers, were surprisingly steady. The night became a primal ordeal, a battle waged against pain, memory, and the fury of the storm. Elura's labor was long and difficult. The waves of pain were relentless, dragging her down into a dark, roaring sea. In the brief moments of respite, she would look at Jedediah, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight, and draw strength from his silent, unwavering presence. He was her anchor in the storm. He wiped her brow with a cool cloth, murmured words of encouragement, his voice a low rumble that was both calming and fierce. "Breathe, Elara. Stay with me. You're strong. We can do this." He was in it with her, every step of the way. He was no longer just the man who had bought her, or the man who had lied for her. He was fighting alongside her, battling the demons of his past to bring a new life into the world. He spoke of Sarah, not with the choked grief of the barn, but with a quiet reverence, telling Elara how brave she had been. He was confronting his deepest trauma, not for himself, but for her. He was redeeming his own past by being present for her future. Hours blurred into a haze of agony and effort. The wind howled, the fire crackled, and the only other sound was Elara's ragged breaths and Jedediah's steady voice. Just before dawn, as the storm outside began to lose its fury, a final desperate push brought their child into the world. A small, perfect cry, thin but piercing, cut through the exhausted silence of the cabin. It was the most beautiful sound Elara had ever heard. Jedediah, his hands trembling now that the ordeal was over, gently cleaned the baby and wrapped her in the soft flannel cloths. He laid the child in Elara's arms, a daughter. She had a shock of dark hair, like Jedediah's, and her tiny, scrunched face was a miracle. Elara looked from her daughter's face to Jedediah's. His face was wet with tears, his usual mask of stoicism completely stripped away. He was not crying for the wife and son he had lost, but for the daughter they had, together, brought into the world. In the quiet, exhausted aftermath of the storm, as the first pale light of dawn filtered through the window, something shifted between them, settling into a place of profound, unbreakable truth. Love had finally been given a name, and its name was family. They had 2 days of fragile, sacred peace. The blizzard broke, leaving behind a world of pristine, silent white. The cabin was a warm cocoon of new life. Jedediah cared for them with a tenderness that was breathtaking. He cooked for Elara, kept the baby, who they had named Hope, swaddled and warm by the fire, and moved through the small space with a quiet joy that transformed him. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep, steady light. It was on the 3rd day that the world intruded. A group of men on horseback appeared, dark figures stark against the endless snow. Elara, watching from the window, felt a cold dread snake around her heart. It was the town sheriff, and with him were Silas Blackwood and Elara's father-in-law, Mr. Abernathy. Jedediah met them at the door, his body a solid, unmoving barrier. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "We've come for the woman and the child," the sheriff said, his tone officious but his eyes uneasy. "Blackwood here has lodged a complaint. He claims the indenture contract he was bidding on was for a single woman, and that this birth complicates the matter. The Abernathys claim you're keeping their grandchild in an unfit home with an immoral woman." "This is my home," Jedediah stated, his voice like ice, "and Elara is my wife." Blackwood sneered from his horse. "You have no marriage certificate, Stone, no proof. You're living in sin with a woman you bought. The law says we can declare her an unfit mother. The child would be better off in a respectable home, my home." His eyes glinted with a possessive, evil light. He didn't want the baby. He wanted to win, to crush Jedediah, and take what he considered his property. Mr. Abernathy, his face pinched and gray with bitterness, nodded in agreement. "The child is my blood. It will not be raised by a half-mad hermit, The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Jedediah, I have a warrant. I have to take them back to town for a hearing." Ilara stood behind Jedediah, clutching hope to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs. They had come to take her baby. After everything they had fought for, the storm, the birth, the fragile peace, the world had come to tear it all apart. This was the final test. To stand and fight or to lose. Everything. Jedediah did not move. He did not reach for the rifle that leaned against the wall. He simply stood there, a bulwark of quiet, unshakable strength. "You are not taking them," he said, his voice soft, but with an undercurrent of steel that made the sheriff pause. "You want to talk about the law? Let's talk about the law of this land. A man's home is his castle. This is my home. A man's family is his own. This is my family. We survived the worst storm this territory has seen in a decade. She brought our child into this world in this room, while the wind tried to tear this house from the earth. We fought for that life together. That is a bond stronger than any piece of paper you can wave in my face." He took a step forward, his eyes boring into the sheriff's. "You want to talk about fitness? Look at these men. One who would buy a woman like cattle, and another who would cast out his own son's flesh and blood. You tell me who is unfit. You will not enter this house. You will not lay a hand on my wife or my daughter. If you try, you will have to kill me first. And I promise you," he finished, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "I will not be the only one to die today." There was no bluster in his words. It was a simple statement of fact, a promise of such absolute conviction that it hung in the cold, still air like a guillotine. The sheriff, a man used to bullies and drunkards, was faced with something entirely different, a man with nothing left to lose, who had finally found everything worth fighting for. The men behind him grew restless, their bravado shrinking under the weight of Jedediah's resolve. Suddenly, another sound broke the tense silence. The crunch of snow, the jingle of a harness. Another wagon was approaching, this one carrying the blacksmith, John, and his wife, Martha. They pulled up beside the sheriff, their faces grim. "Sheriff, what's the meaning of this?" the blacksmith demanded, his powerful voice booming in the quiet. "This is official business, John," the sheriff mumbled. "Official business?" Martha scoffed, her hands on her hips. "Harassing a woman who's just given birth? We saw you right out. We knew it was Blackwood's venom at work." She turned her gaze on Silas Blackwood, her eyes filled with contempt. "You are a soulless man, Silas. And you, Mr. Abernathy, should be ashamed. Your grandchild was just born, and you come here with threats instead of gifts." She walked past the sheriff, past the armed men, and straight to the cabin door. She looked at Jedediah, then past him to Ilara, who stood pale and trembling in the doorway. A warm, brilliant smile lit up Martha's face. "We brought you a cradle," she said, gesturing to a beautifully carved wooden cradle in the back of her wagon, "and a stew. You need to keep your strength up." The sheriff looked from the unyielding man in the doorway to the defiant woman by the wagon, and then to the faces of Blackwood and Abernathy, whose cruel intentions were now laid bare for all to see. He saw the truth of the situation, a truth that had nothing to do with warrants and laws. He was on the wrong side. He straightened up, his face clearing with decision. "This is a family matter," he declared, his voice firm. "Not a legal one. We're leaving." "Sheriff, you can't." Blackwood sputtered, his face contorted in rage. "Go home, Silas," the sheriff said, his voice laced with finality. He turned his horse and without another word led his men away. Blackwood and Abernathy were left sitting on their horses, isolated in their hatred, their power dissolved into the cold winter air. They stared at the cabin, at the small group of people who had formed an unbreakable circle of solidarity around it, and knew they were defeated. With a final venomous glare, they too turned and rode away. Silence descended once more, broken only by the soft coo of the baby in Alara's arms. The sun, bright on the new snow, felt like a benediction. John the blacksmith carried the cradle into the cabin, placing it by the hearth. Martha bustled in with the stew, her presence filling the small room with warmth and life. They didn't stay long. They saw the deep, soul-deep weariness and the profound, quiet joy on the faces of the new parents. They were witnesses to the birth of a family, not by blood, not by law, but by choice, by fire, by storm, and by love. That spring, when the snows had melted and the world was green and new again, they were married. Not in a church, but under the vast open sky, on the porch of the cabin they had rebuilt together. John and Martha were their witnesses. Alara wore a simple blue dress, the color of a hopeful sky, and held hope in her arms. Jedediah stood beside her, his hand holding hers, no longer clumsy or uncertain, but with a rightness that felt as natural as the earth beneath their feet. He looked at her, his stormy eyes clear and full of a love so deep it needed no words, and slipped a simple, hand-carved wooden ring onto her finger. The community, which had once cast them out, now stood witness. Their whispers of judgment turned to murmurs of respect. They were broken. Now they were whole. Later, as twilight settled over the valley, casting long, peaceful shadows, they stood together on that same porch. The air was soft, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Jedediah's arm was around Alara's shoulders, and she leaned her head against his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. Hope slept soundly in the cradle just inside the door, her small breaths a testament to everything they had endured and overcome. They had both been empty, hollowed out by a merciless world, their souls scarred landscapes of loss. But here, in the ruins they had rebuilt, their calloused hands intertwined, they found that two broken halves, when held together by love, did not just make a whole, they created a universe.